Author and attorney based in New York City, has written a book called The Flying Tigers, The Untold Story of the American Pilots Who Waged a Secret War Against Japan. Sam, welcome to KTRS.
Doug, thanks so much for having me. Good morning.
I'm just intrigued. An attorney writing a book about the Flying Tigers. Is there a family connection in here in some way, or just something that intrigued your interest?
Doug, my grandfather was a navigator on a B-25 in the Pacific, and I grew up out in Arizona. So I kind of grew up around listening to his stories. He'd take me out to the Air Museum and show me different planes, and I'd always just kind of had this interest in World War II. And then when I was in graduate school, I was writing about this period in history and came across, actually in a basement at Yale, a trove of love letters between a pilot and a nurse in the Flying Tigers, and I just knew there was a great story to be told with this unit, which was really actually a covert action authorized before Pearl Harbor to send American pilots and planes to go to China to help the Chinese fight the Japanese.
And this was, as you say, the Flying Tigers was their nom de plume. But at the same time, they were flying over, was it the Himalayas, where that was the route that they were taking, if I remember correctly?
So they were, later in the war, flying over the hump would become a major part of American participation in China. The Flying Tigers were this group of young American pilots, including Jim Howard from St. Louis, who has an incredible story in the book, who went over and with false identities had to go over to China before Pearl Harbor, and were in a position to become the first Americans to really score a victory against the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. So in the desolation of December 1941, the story of these young Americans who were fighting back and beating the Japanese in Kunming, China became one of the great sensations of the war and helped to inspire Americans that we could win this war.
Did you have a personal story behind this?
Well, I spent a lot of time with the families of the Flying Tigers. So there's now only one survivor left. His name's Frank Lazonsky, who lives down in Georgia. I was with him just a couple weeks ago. And so a lot of the research that went into the book is based on spending a huge amount of time with the families, and I've become one of the only historians who's been allowed into these reunions that were started in the 1950s and are still ongoing, even though there's only now one survivor left. So the families have trusted me with huge amounts of personal information, letters and diaries, and through the family of Claire Chenault, who is the commander of the unit, got access to the day-by-day combat reports of the unit that were, in a basement in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. that no one's ever seen before. Mm-hmm. So, the access to these families and the trust they've placed in me is something I hold very sacred, and has allowed me to tell this story in a very personal way.
The loss ratio in World War II of using B-17 bombers as an example was incredibly high. What about for the Flying Tigers?
The Flying Tigers had actually a pretty incredible record. They were flying these P-40s that would become famous for the shark face design on the front that listeners might recognize, and they did very well in combat. Chenault taught them these kind of ingenious tactics where they would dive against the Japanese, but of course a number of them did die in combat, and so those stories kind of became national. The nation mourned the loss of these Flying Tigers because they had been following their exploits on an almost daily basis in the newspapers early on in the war.
You said there was a St. Louisan among them, and he had an interesting story. Can you briefly tell us his story?
Absolutely. Jim Howard is well worth listeners' attention in the book. He's actually born in China, and then his father moved the family back to St. Louis. His father was a doctor and was affiliated with WashU. Jim graduated from high school in St. Louis, ends up becoming a pilot in the Army, and became one of the few aviators in the war that was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was with the Flying Tigers in 41, 42, and then ends up going to fight in Europe later in the war as a pilot, and in a really incredible battle over Germany is basically diving against Luftwaffe planes. And when his story was written up in all the newspapers, and he had this kind of attitude of, I was just doing my job, but they awarded him the Medal of Honor for that. So I think it's a wonderful St. Louis story.
So this was sort of a semi-secretive unit, if you will, but not so
Absolutely.
secret that people didn't know that it was going on.
Absolutely. That's kind of one of the interesting things about it is that, word got out pretty quickly because, they started going around to the bases in 1941 and recruiting these pilots. So Time reports on this, this kind of these mysterious recruiters who are going around and picking people off bases to go on these convoys to the Far East. So it was secret in the sense of, obviously this is basically an act of war against Japan, sending over American pilots and planes to fight them. So the Roosevelt administration didn't acknowledge this, and it wasn't actually until the 1990s that these guys finally got the acknowledgement that they were part of an official unit. So for decades, the real story of the Flying Tigers remained secret.
These aircraft that they flew looked like they were built like tanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the P-40 is a Curtiss Wright plane built in Buffalo, New York, and it wasn't the ideal plane for what they wanted, but it sure got the job done. It had a lot of armor on it, so it could take a lot of enemy fire, and a lot of times they were fighting against Japanese bombers that had been basically bombing China without any opposition for years. So they would kind of swoop down and go against the Japanese bombers. Their first battle on December 20th, 1941, just a couple weeks after Pearl Harbor, became a huge success, and the nation, started to celebrate the exploits of the Flying Tigers amidst all the destruction after Pearl Harbor.
So did the Japanese, when they would see these, because it's a very distinctive look for this airplane. It is a tiger mouth, if you will, painted on the very front end of the plane. Very, very distinctive, very visible. So did they earn that reputation that the Japanese would be going, it's them again. We're in for a big battle here.
Yeah, it's actually funny. It's they're Flying Tigers, and it's a shark face design on the cover on the front of the plane, and it's always no one really knows exactly how they got the name the Flying Tigers. There's a lot of debate about it that you can read about more in the book, but they certainly gained a very quick reputation as a formidable foe that you didn't want to go up against.
Yeah, understand that.
So
Sam, I hate to cut you. I'm sorry, we're out of time.
Absolutely.
I would love to go on with this, but I suggest people pick up your book, Flying Tigers: The Untold Story of the American Pilots Who Waged a Secret War Against Japan. That's Sam Kleiner joining us on the Big 550 KTRS.
Thanks so much for having me on.
As a leader in the treatment of erectile dysfunction,
sorry,
the St. Louis Men's Clinic is proud